We all know that Hollow Knight Silksong is a hard game, much more difficult than its predecessor Hollow Knight, especially when it comes to its bosses. I mean, Hollow Knight did have some pretty difficult boss fights, but it almost felt as though every other boss fight in Silksong was just as hard as Hollow Knight's most difficult fight. And that got me thinking, with Silksong's impressive roster of difficult foes, ones that can parry, spawn adds, put maggots on you, do double damage, and or have multiple phases, what exactly would a Pantheon of Pharloom look like? Conquering Hollow Knight's Pantheon of Hallownest was by far the most challenging feat you could do in the game, just due to the sheer endurance you had to beat 40 bosses in a row, and the difficulty of the bosses at the top. But if there is one thing that made it a bit easier than it should be, more than half of the Pantheon of Hallownest consisted of bosses that were merely playthings to the knight. This mainly had to do with the inclusion of both the original and the dream versions of certain bosses, the dream versions being much harder than the originals. Basically, if you could beat the dream version, then you could definitely beat the other, and so those fights, along with a lot of the early game bosses, really only contributed to padding towards the real threats near the top. If we look at the subsections of the Pantheon of Hallownest, split up into 4 distinct parts, or pantheons, then this boss rush only really starts to get difficult around Pantheon 4 section of bosses, which is also the last section. But if we're to similarly split Pharloom's ultimate boss rush into 4 sections, I think we'd find that it starts to get problematic way earlier than it does in the Pantheon of Hallownest. So let's do that. Let's take all of Pharloom's gods, all 44 of them, and try and make a theoretical Pantheon of Pharloom. Hollow Knight Silksong has a very similar number of bosses to Hollow Knight, which is somewhere in the 40 range. Technically, it actually has a lot more, seeing as there are no repeat bosses except for Lace and Trabio, but because Hollow Knight includes all of these repeats in the Pantheons, the number ends up being around the same. Of course, Hollow Knight's Pantheons also include a number of DLC bosses. Hive Knight, Grim, Nightmare King Grim, Grey Prince Zote, and White Defender, as well as the 4 Peak of the Pantheon bosses, are all bosses that weren't in the original game. Since Team Cherry has already mentioned ambitious plans for Silksong's DLC, part of which hopefully includes a god home for Pharloom, there will probably be a couple, or maybe even a bunch of new bosses that'll be in the Pantheon of Pharloom. But of course, we don't know these bosses. It's only been like a month since the main game came out, so all we have to work with, which is still an impressive 43 bosses, is what we get to construct a rough outline of Pharloom's ultimate boss rush. There are some bosses in here that I'm not entirely sure if they even qualify for a boss rush. For example, Lost Garmund and Plasmified Zango are very dull, but they're no more boring than, say, Flukemarm, so I'm gonna include them. The only quote-unquote boss that I'm not including is Summon Savior, because, well, I mean, come on. I'm gonna try and order these bosses similarly to how Hollow Knight did in its Pantheons, which mainly focuses on progression, but also takes difficulty into account when progression becomes ambiguous due to Hollow Knight's semi-linear structure. So let's start from the bottom and look at Pantheon 1 of 4 of a theoretical Pantheon of Pharloom. There are 10 bosses in this tier. Moss Mother, Bell Beast, Skull Tyrant, 4th Chorus, Lace, Savage Beastfly, Morwing, Sister Splinter, Great Conch Flies, and Widow. Pretty simple, nothing too hard yet. It's important to remember that even though a lot of us really struggled against some of these early bosses like Savage Beastfly, Morwing, and Sister Splinter, they're going to be such pushovers with all of our endgame gear. 10 health, a double heal, a max damage needle, every movement option, tools, all things you probably didn't have when fighting these bosses for the first time. The same thing applies to Widow, though she probably will be just as hard if not harder than Nailmasters Oro and Mato, and she's not even a DLC boss. Something interesting I've heard people talk about is the 4th Chorus, and how despite being a massive killer robot designed by the Citadel's architect, they're very simple and are one of the easiest bosses of the early game. I think it'd be cool if, remembering how Hollow Knight's Pantheon of Hallownest buffs certain bosses like Mantis Lords and Nosk, if the 4th Chorus is given a complete overhaul in difficulty and is moved farther up in the Pantheon because of it. Moving on to Pantheon 2, this tier has most of the early Act 2 bosses, 11 in total. Clockwork Dancers, Trabio, Garmund and Zaza, Broodmother, Last Judge, Raging Conchfly, four brothers Cygnus and Gron, Father of the Flame, the Unraveled, Disgraced Chef Lugoli, and Phantom. I know that last judge is an Act 1 boss, technically Phantom is as well, but I had to put her above some of the easier Act 2 bosses because she is just too complex of a boss to start off Pantheon 2. But aside from her, there's still quite a few dangerous ones in here. Trabio, Raging Conchfly, Four Brothers, Lugoli, the Unraveled, and Phantom are all far harder than anything found in Hollow Knight's Pantheon 2. Besides Sisters of Battle, but at least they didn't do 2 damage per hit. Lugoli also introduces the Maggot debuff, which is super punishing, especially in a boss rush when it can carry into the next fight. Even the easier ones, Clockwork Dancers, Father of the Flame, and Broodmother, these 3 all still do 2 damage per hit. It makes Hollow Knight's Pantheon 2 look laughable when it had bosses like Zero, Crystal Guardian, Oblobbles, Flukemarm, Broken Vessel. So already, things are getting a little bit troublesome, but we're only halfway done. Pantheon 3 of Pharloom's boss rush includes the latest of the Act 2 bosses, and starts getting into Act 3. Act 3 is a bit weird because pretty much every boss in this act can be fought in any order that you choose. It all really just comes down to difficulty, so that's how I'm going to be ordering them. So, Pantheon 3 goes... Second Sentinel, Chakra, Roll the Great, Lace 2, Bell Eater, Hail Stag, Plasmified Zango, Voltverm, Lost Garment, Gur the Outcast, and Pinstress. At this point, we're starting to catch up to the endgame standard of gear, and though not too many of these bosses stand out as being very hard, they'll at least be scaled appropriately to take on a full power Hornet. And let's not forget that if Pharloom does end up having Pantheons similar to Hallownest, then there might be bosses atop the peak of each of these Pantheons that prove to be more difficult than any of the bosses below it, like the Nail Masters Oro and Mato, Paint Master Shio, Nail Sage Sly, and the infamous Pure Vessel of Pantheon 4. And speaking of Pantheon 4, this section includes the hardest and most late game bosses. Watcher at the Edge, Crawfather, Nyleth, Clover Dancers, Crust King Khan, Tormented Trabio, Shrine Guardian Seth, Scarsinger Carmelita, First Sinner, Grandmother Silk, and finally, Lost Lace. definitely a hard Pantheon. Doing these last 8 bosses back to back is going to be insane. Grandmother Silk is a boss that I could totally see getting a buff to earn her spot as the penultimate of the Pantheon of Pharloom. She's just really easy, even for an Act 2 boss, and as of now, she hardly lives up to her name as a goddess. I heard some people saying that this probably had something to do with the twisted ending, and how if she was harder, that ending would just be ridiculous to get. So, like the Hollow Knight and Radiance, Grandmother Silk could definitely get a buff in the Pantheons, and I wonder if, due to her Radiance-like appearance and moves, if it'll actually make her the final boss. However, I think Lost Lace being the final boss fits a lot more thematically. To get a little theoristy here for a second, I find it really interesting how the Pantheon of Hallownest has you ascending to the peak of it, opposing the structure of the main game where you start from the top and go to the bottom. Like the Pantheon of Hallownest, Silksong does a similar thing in that it inverts the formula of Hollow Knight. Instead of starting at the top, you begin at the bottom and have to clamber your way to the top to see what's up there. In this case, a god home for Pharloom, or wherever this theoretical boss rush takes place, might flip it again and have us descending through Pantheons to reach the very bottom, making Lost Lace fit very well as the final boss of this ultimate Pantheon. To extend on this, it'd also be interesting if, after killing Lost Lace, instead of carrying Lace's body back up like we do in Silksong's true ending, we instead further our descent down into the void, where we find the Knight, the Lord of Shade, and fight them as our final test. But will this take place in Godseeker's Godhome? Well, since we know that Hollow Knight's Embrace the Void ending seems to be the canon ending with the Shade Lord appearing at the end of Silksong, then that means that Godseeker was killed in the ending of Hollow Knight, and Godhome was taken down with it. However, not only does a variant of this ending blatantly show us Godseeker getting saved from the void by an Everbloom flower, something that is further explained in Silksong, but Hornet's Elegy of the Deep song that she can play on her Needlin allows her to enter the memory of deceased bugs, something that seems perfect for entering a dead Godseeker's Godhome. Lastly, a descension through Pantheons and a void-filled ending to the Pantheon of Pharloom would make sense if the state of Godhome in Silksong is being full and possessed by void, something we see happening as the Knight becomes the Shade Lord. The Shade Lord being the final boss of this Pantheon would also make sense in this context, especially considering we quote-unquote took our place at Pantheon's peak after beating the Pantheon of Hallownest. So that's just my little theory for Silksong's boss rush. Of course, none of this could be correct. Team Cherry could easily just come up with a whole new concept for a Pantheon of Pharloom outside of all the Godmaster stuff. We'll just have to see. Regardless, let's come back to our now established theoretical Pantheon of Pharloom. Is it harder than Hollow Knight's Pantheon of Hallownest? Yes, it is. By a long shot, I would say. First off, with DLC, there's going to be quite a few more bosses in this, probably reaching over 50, while Hollow Knight barely reaches 40, even with all of its DLC and repeat bosses. And not only are there more bosses, but a much higher percentage of these bosses deal the devastating double damage. In Hollow Knight, only the toughest and most endgame bosses use double damage, as it made these bosses so much harder to tank through when they could kill you in just 5 hits instead of 9. In some cases, like for Enraged Guardian and Traitor Lord, it seemed like the only reason why a certain boss was so high up in the Pantheon was not because of its complicated attacks or patterns, but purely because of their double damage. But in Silksong, it is rare to find a boss that doesn't deal double damage, if not with most of their attacks, then with just straight up touching the boss. Even in just Pantheon 1 of our theoretical Pantheon of Pharloom, every single boss except for Moss Mother is capable of delivering 2 damage in a hit. Even with bosses like Lace, Widow, or Trabio, all of them still have specific moves that deal double damage. It honestly makes me wonder if Silksong's DLC is going to bring us a super boss that does 3 masks of damage by default, someone that would be able to kill a full power Hornet in just 4 hits. Now, Hornet does get 1 more mask than the Knight does, but since this only brings us up to an even 10, bosses that deal double damage will still kill Hornet in the same amount of strikes. And now let's talk about charms. A standard charm setup for Hollow Knight's Pantheons is vastly the same between all players. Unbreakable Strength and Quick Slash are the bare minimum for these boss rushes, and you'd have to be crazy to attempt these challenges for the first time without these 2 charms. On top of that, players can also choose from Mark of Pride, Shaman Stone, Unbreakable Heart, Quick Focus, Nailmaster's Glory, or Grub Song, all fantastic charms. But in Silksong, strictly speaking about blue and yellow tools, I'd actually say that there's not a single blatantly supremely overpowered charm, and none that are as good as Quick Slash and Unbreakable Strength were in Hollow Knight. There are some that are clearly better than others, but needless to say, Team Cherry did a much better job at balancing their charm system so that players can make completely unique setups that are just as viable as anything else. However, this just makes even the setup for the Pantheon of Pharloom much more complicated than Hollow Knight, because there isn't just a brain-dead set of charms that trumps any kind of other setup. From what I can tell right now, it seems like there's an equal amount of viability between Silk Skill, Red Tool, and Needle setups. Then again, I have seen stuff like this. And DLC charms, tools, and balance changes could definitely change things. Regardless, for casual players, there doesn't seem to be any blatantly obvious setup that'll make Silksong's boss rush easier, especially when it comes to the finite amount of red tools you can throw before a sit down at a bench is required. There is going to have to be some legitimate strategy that every player is going to have to come up with in order to beat this challenge. And one more thing that I can tell is going to make Silksong's final Pantheon much harder than Hollow Knight's. It's an overarching threat, something that can happen to you in Hollow Knight, but is significantly more devastating if it happens in Silksong. You see, in Hollow Knight, the act of healing can be split up into the regeneration of individual masks. If you get hit while you're trying to heal, it's not good. You lose the bit of soul that you were using, and you lose another mask, but no big deal. You keep all of the soul that you didn't use, and probably only took 1 extra damage anyway. However, in Silksong, getting hit while trying to heal is catastrophic. In some ways, it is easier for Hornet to heal than it was for the Knight, as she can do it in the air and she heals 3 masks much faster than the Knight could. But the trade-off for this is that you can't divvy up your Silk to heal individual masks. Instead, you need a total of 9 Silk Spools in order to start a 3-mask heal. And when you get hit while doing this heal, first off, not only are you probably going to be hit with double damage on top of already trying to heal double damage, but you lose all 9 Silk Spools that you were using, with no heal, and another 2 health gone. By this point, you're now super low on health if not already dead, and so much pressure is now suddenly put on you because you have to land another 6 to 9 hits just to heal again so that you can get out of being in the danger zone. You'll go from being on top of the Silk versus hit game to suddenly being so far behind that depending on the boss, you might as well just restart. But in a boss rush, you can't just restart. For all we know, you could be 37 bosses in, and you just so happen to unluckily try and heal in some risky spot, leaving you in this horrible situation. And that's the thing, in a boss rush that is 44 plus bosses long that takes nearly an hour to complete, this is bound to happen at least once, if not multiple times. And let me tell you guys, the further you get into these things, the higher the nerves start to build as the thought of having to do this all again grows in the back of your mind. And nerves are the exact thing that not only causes you to heal in greedy, dumb spots, but makes recovering from this kind of situation so much harder. So all of these things, the number of bosses, the complexity and power that so many of these bosses have, the lack of supremely overpowered charms that forces the player to actually develop their own strategy, and the overarching threat of accidentally getting hit while you're healing, all of these things make me think that not only is Silksong's Pantheon of Pharloom going to be hard, it's going to be really hard. So I can't wait to see how we all fare when we get that Godmaster update for Silksong. In the meantime, I'm definitely going to be thinking about strategy with everything we have on a 100% save. I do really hope that we get DLC for Silksong before too long. In the case of Hollow Knight, it took a year and a half after the game's initial release for the final DLC, which added Godhome, to be added to the game. So I hope that for this game, the wait will be similarly as long or shorter, but if we're being realistic, it probably will take longer. Just not another 7 years, Team Cherry, please, and some status updates would be nice too. It'll be very interesting to see by that point just how advanced the speedrun tech for Silksong is, and what has been discovered about the game's tool, charm, and crest metagame. But until then, thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, consider subscribing. This is the channel's first Hollow Knight / Silksong video, and I most definitely will be making more in the future as we get closer to Silksong's DLC. If you're new to the channel, I also make Deltarune, Terraria, and Zelda videos, so go check them out if you're interested. But anyways, that's it for me. Thanks for watching until the end, and I'll see you guys in the next video.